good evening and greetings and salutations to all my fellow ministers, our esteemed ambassadors, our parliamentarians, and the distinguished delegates. Let me start by saying that it is indeed an honor to be part of this dialogue. And I would want to take the opportunity to sincerely thank the organizers for inviting me to participate at a time when humanity is at a crossroads due to the unprecedented rate of biodiversity loss, land degradation, and the effects of climate change. Scientists have repeatedly told us that our planet is at a tipping point. And Excellencies, we know that it is now 3 decades since the adoption of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and yet biodiversity loss still continues at a rate which is now threatening the achievement of 14 of the Sustainable Development Goals. I would also want to echo the words of other speakers who have raised concern that none of the 20 Aichi targets were fully met. This places, as others have said, an enormous burden on all of us to ensure that the outcomes of the upcoming CBD COP deliver an ambitious and well-designed post-2020 global biodiversity framework. We need clear targets that will put nature on a path to recovery in the next decade and beyond. We need a clear plan to enable people, particularly in developing countries, to secure their lives and livelihoods in harmony with nature. Excellencies, we meet today as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to undermine socio-economic development across the globe. This has added to the challenges faced by many developing countries, particularly on the African continent. The pandemic has adversely impacted on resource availability at a time when the region is facing a multitude of interrelated problems, including rising debt levels. This puts attaining the Sustainable Development Goals and the aspirations of Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, at risk. On the conservation front, the global decline of tourism has placed considerable strain on the financial sustainability of protected areas on our continent. Loss of income by communities living on the borders of protected areas increases food insecurity and threatens a rise in illicit trade in wild species. This in turn, as we all know, will impact further on the vexed question of biodiversity loss. Our own country, South Africa, as you know, is one of the 3 mega biodiverse nations on Earth. Yet we have not been spared the effects of the pandemic and the subsequent economic crisis on our conservation efforts. Our nation's biodiversity provides an array of benefits to the economy, society, and human well-being, and there still remain opportunities to be unlocked through biodiversity-based economic activities. Even before the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, our 2018 National Biodiversity Assessment highlighted the urgent need to address threats from habitat loss due to fragmentation and degradation, pollution, impacts on wetlands, climate change, and invasive alien species. The assessment prioritized efforts directed at improving habitat connectivity and restoration, protecting wetlands and strategic water sources, enhancing ecosystem resilience, conservation of species most threatened and vulnerable to extinction, and towards regulating or prohibiting activities which have an adverse impact on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Accordingly, as our country implements our economic recovery plan, we have prioritized public employment in areas such as restoration of wetlands, water sources, and other ecosystem services. Ladies and gentlemen, at a regional level, The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services 2018 indicates once more that biodiversity is diminishing at unprecedented rates, with current consumption and production patterns overshooting the Earth's carrying capacity and threatening our collective future. Accordingly, here on the African continent, we do sincerely hope that the post-2020 global biodiversity framework will indeed provide our continent with a new opportunity to shape the global plan for sustainable development and biodiversity into a meaningful and responsive tool for the continent's developmental ambitions. It is our considered view that this can only be achieved if we can agree on certain common principles. The first of these, as other speakers have mentioned, is multilateralism. While we respect the sovereign rights of all countries over their own biological resources and the need for countries to address the overriding priorities of socio-economic development and the eradication of poverty, we also believe that any retreat from multilateralism threatens our collective global responsibility and ability to tackle shared and critical global risks to biodiversity. In this regard, we also think it is important, as others have said, to foster synergies in multilateral environmental agreements, particularly the CBD on biodiversity loss, the UNFCCC on climate change, and the UNCCD on desertification, drought, and land degradation. We motivate this from an understanding that the challenges we face in each of these areas are deeply interlinked. Our third principle is that there needs to be equal ambition and equal treatment of the three objectives of the CBD, namely conservation, sustainable use, and access and benefit sharing of genetic resources. The three objectives of the CBD are the main pillars towards the achievement of the 2050 vision for biodiversity of living in harmony with nature, and therefore they should be properly reflected in the post-2020 framework. Lastly, we remain convinced that if we are to achieve ambitious goals, these ambitious goals need to be equally matched with ambition with regard to the means of implementation, which must include, but is not limited to, finance, capacity building, and cooperation of sharing of technological innovations. The burden for biodiversity conservation in the post-2020 governance cannot be unduly placed on the shoulders of developing countries, who remain today the custodians of biodiversity, especially mega biodiverse countries. And I suppose it would be very interesting in the question and answer session to discuss how, if developing countries are to shoulder this burden for the world, they should be adequately compensated. We must observe the principle of common but differentiated approach to conservation, while noting that the parties at COP15 are not renegotiating the text of the convention. And we hope that COP15 will result in enhancing sustainable use and realizing a fair and equitable share of benefits from the use of genetic resource incentives, as well as promoting a whole society approach to the protection of biodiversity and ecosystems. If we understand that climate change will affect different nations and different communities within nations in different ways, the same can also be said for biodiversity loss and the ways it will manifest differently according to local conditions. In particular, we understand that these phenomena will impact most severely on women, who are primarily responsible for the provision of food and water in rural African communities. This makes the mainstreaming of our responses to biodiversity loss and ecosystem restoration and conservation so very important on our continent. Equal attention should be given to the priority work under the Biosafety Protocol and the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing, both of which are critical to sustainable development. It is also imperative that COP15 observe evidence-based decision-making and respects the outcome of science and global assessments. We cannot afford to ignore the predictions from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, nor the grim projection that almost 1 million species are facing extinction. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, a successful COP15 will therefore be one where parties agree to adopt a framework that is both ambitious and realistic in the adequate and predictable means of implementation. The framework must be based on well-designed goals and targets, formulated in clear and simple language, and capacity building initiatives will be crucial to ensure that there is a robust process of accountability and reporting. Excellencies, I would like to conclude by saying that both the pre- and the post-2020 biodiversity era should be premised on inclusivity, which integrates all stakeholders, including women, Indigenous people, local communities, youth, and civil society. We must ensure that we leave no one behind. As the well-known African proverb says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I thank you.